Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. It's Jessica Ward King, the StigmaCrusher here. So recently I've been giving a lot of talks. It's been Mental Health Week here in Canada. A lot of different groups are having conversations about mental health. And there's something that happens when you get up in front of a crowd, right? Doesn't matter how many times you've done it, doesn't matter how much you love it, your body reacts. And I talked about this a little bit in my last video when I was talking about the gut and the way that the body needs, when it's facing, whether it's facing an ancient mastodon or whether it's facing public speaking, the body reacts in a certain way. It's a stress it's a stress response, so a fight or flight or freeze response. And so the body does a couple of really key things. It expands the rib cage so that you can breathe more deeply, so that you can run. It takes your energy, so the blood, the metabolism, it takes that and moves it to the large muscles in your body, like your legs and your arms, so that you can run or go and hide or whatever you need to do. And that can be, and it also causes adrenaline to flow, right? Which is part of the whole cascade that has all these things happening. The adrenaline makes your heart pump faster and more strongly. It can also really cloud your cognitive reasoning abilities, because at this point you don't need to think through what you're doing to run away from the mastodon. You just need to run or to hide, right? You don't need higher reasoning capabilities at this point. And this can be really problematic in our modern culture, because when you're facing, like, say, a public speaking situation, you do need to be using those higher cognitive functions, right? You don't necessarily need to have your heart beating so loud that you can hear it in your eyeballs. You don't necessarily need for all the blood to rush out of your digestive system and your organs, your inner organs, and go to your muscles, right? You need to be able to continue to digest food throughout the day. And so when we have this stress response, it's supposed to, like, historically, evolutionarily, it is supposed to have been a fairly short-term response. Mastodon's coming, you need to run away or hide, and you're away from the mastodon, or you're eaten. I mean, one or the other, right? Like, you either get away or you're eaten, but like, this is a minutes long, not hours long process. Certainly not days or weeks long process. Our body can't sustain the stress response for that long. Our hearts can't beat that hard for that long. Our digestive systems and organs need the energy to do what they need to do. They can't be shut down for that long. But in our modern culture, we are finding less of running away from mastodons and a lot more of sustained stress. So whether that be stress from the workplace, stress from home and family life, stress from finances, stress from, you name it, there is stress in our lives. Today, though, I wanted to talk about the difference between stress and anxiety. We tend to use the words fairly interchangeably. I'm so stressed out, I'm anxious. And they're not the same thing. So there's a couple of distinctions that I want to make here. One of them is that anxiety is actually, so stress is usually about something, right? I'm stressed out about the test. I'm stressed out about the public speaking engagement. I'm stressed out about my finances, about my boss, about. Anxiety is actually stress about stress. Basically, we can't always pinpoint the root cause of anxiety, but anxiety is a sustained stress response to stress. And something that differentiates stress from anxiety. So stress can last a long time, but anxiety lasts a long time even after the stressor has been removed. So when we talk about people having social anxiety, for example, even when they are in their houses all by themselves, they still have the anxiety about other people. If you have agoraphobia, so that's a fear of being in large spaces and being around people again, you are anxious about that, about just thinking about it. You're anxious about the possibility that it could happen, right? So it's not just stress about being in that situation, it's anxiety because you're stressed out about the stress of being in that situation. And there are a few things that, so we also talk about anxiety disorders, right? So I've been talking about social phobia or agoraphobia or things like that, obsessive compulsive disorder, uh, post-traumatic stress disorder. These are all what we call anxiety disorders. And anxiety disorders are actually the most common psychiatric disorder in the entire world. By far, it's like 20% of people that have psychiatric disorders have anxiety, and then like the rest is all the rest of the disorders. I think depression is the next closest at maybe 11, or is it 8? I can't remember. And so anxiety disorders are by far the most common, probably partly because of the increase of stress. Anxiety is stress about stress, and the stress goes up, the anxiety is going to go up too. Part of the problem with the fight or flight or freeze response in our modern times is that we're quite often not finding ourselves being able to flee. So we're not running away from our boss. We're not like literally running away from our stress. And we're not often able to hide from it, although sometimes we are. So, for example, when you are struggling with social phobia and you choose to stay inside away from people rather than go see them, that really is, that's a hiding. So a fleeing, fleeing response. But we don't often fight either, right? We don't often fight our boss or fight our deadlines or fight our finances. We often end up freezing. Freezing in place, finding ourselves unable to act, unable to do the things that we need to do to get rid of the stressor. And that can be really problematic, obviously, because we find ourselves powerless, we find ourselves hopeless. And so that's a really troublesome feature of anxiety. Now, there are a number of things that can turn stressors into anxiety. And some of those things include the number of stressors, like the simple number of stressors in someone's life. Someone that has stress about, let's say, school or work, but is okay financially, is okay for friends, is okay for, it has food on the table, that kind of thing, has fewer stressors than someone whose like biopsychosocial model is looking like those protective factors aren't there. Those stressing factors are numerous. And also I want to mention the protective factors. So the number of protective factors that someone has. So that can include social protective factors, financial protective factors, protection from things like racism and discrimination. Those protective factors that exist also can reduce the possibility of turning stress into anxiety. It's also the nature of the stressors, the duration of the stressors, and most importantly, the amount of control one feels one has over those stressors. So if you are having financial issues, but you can take control of them, and like say you're in debt, but you're able to get assistance, you're able to get a payment plan, you're able to get a job that's going to help you pay down that debt, and you feel like you've got some level of control over it. Or if you're talking about work and you're feeling stress about what's going on at work, but you can talk to your boss and you can figure out what your priorities are and you can get a hold of it, that's less likely to have that stress of work or of finances turn into persistent anxiety, because you do feel like you have a degree of control over it. Now, it doesn't always work, right? Sometimes we feel like we take control of the situation, it turns into anxiety anyway. These are just factors that are more protective, that reduce the possibility of stress turning into anxiety. Other things do include, so I've mentioned social support. That's really important. Being able to let a load off, basically. So being able to get away from the stress, being able to separate oneself from the stressors. And basically, so I've mentioned that like anxiety is stress about stress, and it exists even when the stressors are taken away. Being able to actually take yourself away from those stressors for a period of time to relax, essentially, and to not think about the stressors for a period of time can be really helpful. Now, this is where people get into a little bit of trouble, because there are things that seem to help in terms of relaxing and taking your mind off of your stress, like alcohol and drugs, that ultimately can contribute to poor outcomes with stress and anxiety. Alcohol, even though it's a depressant, it can actually, when you rebound from it, have anxiety-inducing effects. Certain drugs, legal or illegal, can have effects on that system as well, and on the brain, that can increase anxiety. And so even though they seem like in the moment they're helping you take a load off, that can lead to a cycle that is really damaging. So just a caveat there. There are also some things that you can do if you are finding, so these are things you can't really help, like genetics even. Genetics is another thing. There are some folks that have that's the stress diathesis model. So if the stress happens and they have this predisposition to anxiety disorders, then if the stress happens, it's going to result in an anxiety disorder. These are things you can't really do much about. What can you do if you're finding yourself under stress and you don't want it to turn into anxiety, or you're worried that it's turning into anxiety? What can you do? So this first piece of advice is where I kind of used to roll my eyes, because I always said, well, I can't think my way out of anxiety. I can't mindfulness or yoga or breathe my way out of anxiety. Possibly somewhat true. I mean, you can't mental health your way out of a mental illness. However, it's a lot easier to deal with mental illness if your mental health is good. And it's a way to protect against developing mental illness, to keep your mental health in tip-top shape. So things that do help with your mental health are relaxing activities like mindfulness, like yoga, Pilates, anything that gentle exercises that keep the body moving, allow you time to reflect. It can be things like coloring, it can be knitting, it can be any kind of exercise that you find relaxing. Those kinds of things that really nourish your mental health and teach you how to diffuse some of that stress. As well as when you're talking about like breathing and mindfulness and yoga, they can teach you how to breathe deeply. So instead of, when you find your heart beating fast and you find the stress coming, you can learn to breathe deeply. That automatically kind of short circuits the whole system that's contributing to your stress and anxiety, and can help your body actually calm down and reduce adrenaline and reduce all of those effects of the body that cause the stress to be so problematic. So that's number one. Number two is to draw on those social support systems. So having family and friends who love you is one thing. Actually drawing on them to support you is another. Right? And so nobody wants to be the burden or be the downer or be the stressor on other people. But that's what your social supports are there for. They're there to support you, also being mindful that you're there to support them. And so having that two-way social support is really important. It gives you a way to take a load off, but B, it also makes you feel useful and gives you purpose in your life to be able to help a friend or a family member in need. So being able to do, that bi-directional social support is super important. Another thing you can do is keep your body healthy. So again, rolling eyes, I know, but like eating right, exercising, mild, moderate exercise is fine. Walking in nature is even better. We know that nature tends to reduce stress and cortisol levels and hormones that like adrenaline that really affect your stress. So doing those things, keeping your body healthy, making sure you're putting into it what you want to get out of it. I know, I'm the worst one, but it is a way of reducing the stress and anxiety in our lives. Another way is to kind of reorient yourself the way you're thinking about it. And this is kind of that aspect of control that we were talking about. So instead of thinking this stress is taking over my life and there's nothing I can do about it, kind of being able to realize the things, it's the old adage, right? Recognize the things that you cannot change the things you can, and the wisdom to know the difference. That's really important when you're thinking about stress and when you're talking about it developing into anxiety. Is the anxiety is stressing about the stress. So if you know what you can change and take steps to change it, that's that aspect of control. And if you know the things that you cannot change, and if you can figure out how to let them be, to understand that it is what it is, right? This is harder than it sounds. And that's where a professional can be helpful. So just short targeted counseling or therapy can be super helpful in figuring out which are the stressors you can change and which aren't, and what you can do to change it. Even talking with a social worker, especially if the issues are family, if the issues are financial, a social worker can help with those really functional pieces about, how to work with a landlord to pay rent a little later, or work with a financial consultant for debt insolvency, or whatever the case is, right? So working with a social worker can really help. Reaching out for those supports sooner rather than later. Trying to craft your own, if job is a concern, job crafting is a really good idea. So being able to talk with your boss about like where you want to go and what you want to do in your job, and what kind of training you might be able to get that would help you get there, because we know that continuous learning really helps to reduce stress. So there are a variety of things you can do. It can seem impossible when the stress is turning into anxiety because of that freeze, that fight, that flight response that you automatically have when the stress is building up. You don't want to stop, take a breath, ask for help. You want to get away. And short-circuiting that is really the first step to short-circuiting the anxiety. It is worth it. Obviously, nobody wants anxiety. But also remember not to blame the people that are struggling with anxiety. It's not that they just didn't do it good enough, or they're not mindfulness enough, or they're not meditating often enough. Anxiety is a mental illness that you can't mental health away. You can't magic it away. And it's not necessarily that they did something wrong. In fact, it's almost certain that they didn't do something wrong. This is an illness that people struggle with, and they can develop, because of their biology. It could be because of the social factors that are in place. And remembering that everybody does have different stressors. We can't always see them on the surface. Social media is terrible for this. You don't see the stressors that people are under. You see their perfect life. You see their perfect spouse, their perfect kids, their perfect dog, their perfect house, their manicure, their everything. And you don't see all the stress that people are under. So we don't know what is contributing to someone developing anxiety or not. So even though I've given you some kind of tips and tricks to avoid that stress turning into anxiety, this is kind of your PSA not to blame someone that does have anxiety for causing their own disorder or not being able to fix it. So those are my meditations on anxiety and stress, and how they are different, and how we might be able to take control and try to reduce that anxiety. If you have any ideas about things you'd like to hear me talk about, please do let me know in the comments down below. If you have any experience with anxiety reducing techniques, I know we all have different experiences and different things that have worked for us. Please do share. People would love to know what's worked for you, and maybe they can try it themselves. And take care of yourselves this week. I will see you in my next one. Bye.
StigmaCrusher.